Hello and a warm welcome to yet another edition of Let's Talk Policy, brought to you by the Kautilya School of Public Policy based in Hyderabad. I'm Smita Sharma, an independent journalist and a visiting faculty at the Kautilya School of Public Policy. और क्योंकि आप इस कार्यक्रम को कौटिल्या के YouTube और मेरे YouTube स्टेशन स्मिता शर्मा जर्नलिस्ट पर भी देख सकते हैं, तो हमारे तमाम दर्शकों को भी नमस्कार, आदाब हमेशा की तरह। और ये एक ऐसा मंथली टॉक सीरीज है जहां पर हम डीप डाइव कॉन्वर्सेशंस करते हैं एक्सपर्ट्स के साथ में, जो ऐसे मुद्दे हैं जो पॉलिसी एस्पिरेंट्स के लिए बेहद जरूरी हैं, जो खबरों में तो हैं लेकिन हम उसे एक न्यूज चैनल के तौर पर नहीं, एक पॉलिसी प्रैक्टिशनर के तौर पर देखते हैं। बातें कंटेम्पररी भी होती हैं। सो टुडे आई थिंक इट्स अ वेरी टाइमली टॉपिक एंड two extremely distinguished guests that we have on the panel. I'm sure there'll be a lot of insights that they will be sharing with us. And for those of you who have already tuned in, welcome to the show. As always, if you have questions, feel free to drop into the chat box or just use the raise hand emoticon, and I will try and incorporate those questions as well during the course of this conversation. But let me start by talking about our two guests first and why this is such a timely conversation. I have with me Lieutenant General Sanjiv Langar, who's a retired distinguished military veteran with a service span of 39 years. लगभग 4 दशकों का आपका मिलिट्री का करियर रहा। ऑपरेशनल लॉजिस्टिक आपने बहुत सारे कार्यभार संभाले हैं। During his work, he dealt with strategic and operational issues with the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Home Affairs, as well as the Ministry of External Affairs. And he was also the first Indian to be selected to serve at the UN headquarters as an international civil servant under the Department of Peacekeeping for Africa region. So he wears many hats. Thank you so much, General Langar, for joining us here.
Thank you.
I also have with me, of course, Air Vice Marshal Dr. Arjun Subramaniam, जो कि retired fighter pilot है Indian Air Force के. He has commanded a MiG-21 squadron, a large flying base. He's held several operational, staff, instructional assignments in the Indian Air Force. He's also an air power doctrinal expert, having crafted the Indian Air Force doctrine in 2012. And he was awarded the Ati Vishishta Seva Medal for Distinguished Service by the President of India in 2011. He has a PhD in Defense and Strategic Studies from the University of Madras. He's a visiting fellow at the Harvard Asia Center, Oxford University, and also, of course, at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Again, somebody who wears many hats. And both of these esteemed gentlemen are also visiting faculty at the Kautilya School of Public Policy. Dr. Subramaniam, thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thank you for having me on your show.
So, I think we are in the middle of one of the most unprecedented sort of situations in the world. अभी हम कुछ महीने पहले तक रशिया यूक्रेन वॉर पर हम फोकस थे. There's also that war that is going on between Israel and Hamas, Gaza में, Palestine में, and then you have the Iran war, which perhaps the Americans calculated and thought this will get over in 3-4 days. It's past 6 weeks, and the war has so much for, I think, militaries across the world to learn from. And perhaps there's so much that the Indian armed forces can also teach to the world when it comes to the military doctrine. So we're going to talk about all of these issues today. And, first, before I get into the theoreticals of military doctrine, General Langar, there is this popular saying that tactics and strategy are different. और वो बहुत देखने को मिल रहा है इस Iran war में in particular. Your particular thoughts on how the war has shaped up, and what is it that has kind of really surprised you, or that you think is something to watch out for from the war?
Well, to start with, आपने जो बोला that tactics and strategy are different, we have to understand the interdependence of the plane of warfare now. All right. These statements, a lot of them hark back to military historians who were informed the First, Second World War, starting from the American Civil War, a generation of warfare. But, in fact, armies and armed forces went to the extent of doing promotions based on whether a person was a good tactical commander and a good operator. There was an operational level in between and then a strategic level. They are interlinked. There was an ability to establish some kind of a division in the earlier years. But I would say commencing from this new genre of warfare, which I peg to the first Gulf War, starting from there, it is an interconnected domain. No strategy. And of course, there is no argument about strategy, because strategy and politico-military strategy is the highest level of decision making that a nation engages in. So politico-military decision making at the national level is strategic. There's absolutely no doubt about it. It is strategic. But it cannot be strategic without a clear appreciation of what is tactical. So it's not that you have a certain set of parameters and you sign off on them, and then you hope that other people are going to interpret it and implement it, to the best of their ability and hopefully meet the strategic objectives. Those days have gone. It's an interconnected domain. It's a complex domain. It's a domain which is extending from deep space to undersea, and in great specificity. There has to be dominance of each of these. Air used to be considered, we used to talk about air as one domain. It's not one domain anymore. Leave space aside. Even air is now subdivided into elements that operate across it. So unless at the strategic level of initial planning, where you give strategic direction to a military campaign or to a military offensive or to a military engagement, you're intimately aware of what is tactically feasible, you will always stumble in the 21st century paradigm. So let's get that very clear. Anyone who seeks to create a division, yes, of course, there are tactical actions and there are operational level actions, but they all are interlinked. Today, there is an ability of a tactical action to completely upset the strategy. Today, there is that ability. And you have to be alive to that. As far as coming to these two conflicts are concerned, well, the conflict which is taking place in the Gulf is a very, very unique kind of a conflict. Firstly, it is designed by a nation, which is the United States, which has an extraordinary expeditionary power. Not all nations have this power. In fact, I have no hesitation in saying, in the realm of extraordinary power, that has now become a separate category, there is no match for the United States. There is absolutely no match. So therefore, it has exercised extraordinary expeditionary power. Right. Now, whether it has met the initial objectives, whether subsequent objectives have to emerge, well, that is pretty evident. But we always say as military personnel that no plan, no strategy, no direction ever survives the first contact. The moment the first bullet or the first round is fired, everything gets modified, right? So you are seeing an engagement where there is an extraordinary military power which has this projection capability, which is waging a conflict in a zone which is extremely far from the motherland, from the homeland. Sorry, not motherland, from the homeland. And so that must be clearly understood, because not everybody is in that league. You can't do it, right? Now, to your last part of whether we are surprised or not, it is not feasible for military personnel to be surprised by these kind of, shall I say, engagements, because they're exceedingly difficult, they're very distant, they're very tricky, and they involve a huge spectrum of unknown capabilities, which no matter what degree of intelligence you may have, you will not have a deep insight into. I will hold my horses here and let the discussion develop.
Okay, I think those were some very interesting and broad overview and points that you made there, sir. Taking forward the question, Dr. Subramaniam here, he's made it very clear that the two things also go hand in hand. Your observations, does it look like a very asymmetrical warfare? And does it change the rules of the game for an asymmetrical warfare?
First, let me, before I directly answer your second question, Let me add on a few thoughts to what General Sanjiv Langar has mentioned. Now, to put it very simply, how do you understand strategy, operations, and tactics, right? Strategy can be looked at as a bunch of ideas emanating from the top of policy circles, from the strategic establishment, from the very senior political strategic leadership. Now, how do you convert these ideas into outcomes that you are looking for? These outcomes are created by operations and tactical practitioners, right? So during earlier days, you could say that victory and defeat depended on how operational and tactical practitioners converted strategic ideas into victory and defeat. In today's context, victory and defeat are actually outdated notions. Today, no longer can you talk in terms of victory or defeat. The best you can hope for are outcomes. And that is what actually India has proved to be very successful in the recent past as to how wage wars with limited political outcomes rather than look at maximalist expectations that are not able to be converted properly by operational and tactical practitioners based on what the requirements are. And that is something that we are seeing being played out in the Gulf War. Now, as far as your second question is concerned, the thing is that you talked about asymmetric warfare. I think what we are seeing here are classic manifestations of carefully thought out asymmetric strategies against the world's #1 military power, right? And for that, one has to understand the fact that the only way in which Iran has managed to stay on its feet thus far is because of a very carefully thought out and assiduously built up asymmetric military strategy, not over the last few years, but over many, many decades, right? And I think that's something that your viewers must understand, is that America's application of conventional military power exclusively through the medium of air has been truly spectacular. It has managed to sort of literally decimate Iran's military capability. But has it managed to achieve the outcomes that it set out for itself right in the beginning? No, it hasn't yet been able to do that. And that is something that General Langar was talking about, is that it's very, very difficult to predict any certainties of warfare today, given the kind of gray zone capabilities that are available, given the fog of war, the uncertainty of war. So I think the jury will still be out as to where this conflict is headed over the next few weeks.
So also, if I could just follow up, while we're talking about whether it is asymmetrical or not, whether इसमें strategy, जैसा आपने कहा, बहुत जरूरी बात कही कि मिलिट्री गोल्स तो शायद आप अचीव कर रहे हैं, लेकिन जो आउटकम्स आप चाहते थे युद्ध से, क्या वो आउटकम्स अचीव हुई हैं या नहीं, द स्ट्रेटेजिक पॉलिटिकल आउटकम्स. Having said that, also in terms of this popular belief that wars, of course, are won with great air power. And it applies even to the Indian example कि हमको air power की बहुत जरूरत है. Do you see also a changing nature of warfare itself now, which is not conventional, which is a different kind of air power we are talking about, and a lot of technological dependence as well?
So, Smita, I am a great, I do not for one moment believe that air power can win wars alone, irrespective of the trajectory of contemporary conflicts, right? Air power alone cannot win wars. What we are experiencing today is something known as multi-domain operations, right? And multi-domain operations is something that encompasses domains that what one couldn't even think of 10 years ago. So whether it is space, whether it is nuclear deterrence, whether it is conventional warfighting capability, whether it is ultimately the requirement for boots on ground, and even boots on ground does not ensure that you would be able to achieve the outcomes that you have set out to achieve. For example, the United States placed boots on ground both in Iraq and Afghanistan, and yet they couldn't achieve the very maximalist political outcomes that they set out for themselves, which was actually to change the political system itself in these two countries. So, it is it is a fallacy to believe that air power practitioners today across the world believe that air power can win wars on its own. No, it cannot. Even in the Indian context, at no stage has the Indian Air Force or have air power practitioners said that air power can win the next conflict on its own. But what air power can do is it can shape the battlefield environment like never before, cause tremendous amount of attrition, deliver significant blows to the enemy's morale. But after that, it has to be a whole of government approach that has to be rolled out in order to achieve the outcomes that have been set out. And you talked about air power, some of the other dimensions of air power. Of course, earlier on, it was only fixed wing aircraft, offensive aircraft platforms that were involved. Today, we have missiles also controlling the aerial domain, and we have drones. But at no stage, maybe I'll come to that later, as to what are some of the lessons that one can draw and not embrace blindly from the Indian context from what is happening in Iran or in Russia or Ukraine.
Absolutely, sir. Hold your thoughts. मैं उसके लिए वापस आऊंगी आपके पास में. But General Langer, just to keep it a little bit more contextual in terms of what is happening right now, जैसा एयर वाइस मार्शल ने कहा कि आप सिर्फ एयर पावर से जो है कोई युद्ध तो जीत नहीं सकते हैं, लेकिन जहां तक बूट्स ऑन द ग्राउंड का सवाल है, ईरान में एक ऐसा वक्त आया जहां ये लगा कि अमेरिका जो है उन्होंने अपने पैराट्रूपर्स, अपने मरीन्स को भेज दिया है मिडिल ईस्ट में, एंड दे आर वेरी क्लोज टू लॉन्चिंग अ बूट्स ऑन द ग्राउंड ऑपरेशन. Did you sense that that would happen? Of course, right now we are in the middle of an interim ceasefire. And if boots on the ground does happen in a country like Iran, what do you see as the possible challenges that America would have to, sort of draw into the calculations?
Okay, so let me just caveat it with one or two examples from history. This is nothing, as I said, it's not to say that history repeats itself, that's not correct, but you get echoes from the past. So after the complete recapture of the Pacific in this huge American offensive in the Second World War, you came to the homeland Japan. And despite obliterating Tokyo, obliterating cities with firebombing, they did not surrender. You dropped one nuclear weapon at Hiroshima, they did not surrender. You second at Nagasaki, and the king forced himself to go to the radio station. There was still a very strong caucus which wanted him to continue to fight and die to the end. So getting political ends in wars are very different to what you may strategize, because it's not a one-way traffic. There is another protagonist on the other end. So let's be very clear on that. So what America and all may have set out and what has transpired, this is nothing new. This is well known in the outcome of warfare. As far as air power is concerned, as a person on the ground, we need to appreciate the exceptional air capability that has now been built up due to technology, as well as the splitting up of the air, shall I say, envelope between drones, low-level operating drones, medium and large, high-range drones, aircraft, space. It is an exceptional capability. So yes, again, it goes back to what are your war aims? What is your objective? Let's go to a recently concluded conflict, which may not be there in the memory of people, Syria. You had the whole world attacking ISIS in Syria. There was no shortage of air power, there was no shortage of ground power, there were all kinds of militias, armies, everyone was attacking. How long did it take to capture Raqqa? 10 months. How long did it take to capture Mosul? 11 months. That is the nature of war. Whether you have air power, whether you apply ground force, if you say that your objectives are to take these areas and sanitize the whole nation, the whole ground, it's an enormous amount of time, enormous amount of effort, not unsimilar to what armies went through in the Second World War. Not unsimilar. All right. So let's be a bit clear on that. आप कह रहे हैं Americans have brought, yes, there are many reasons why they have brought the ground element. One is, a threat in being. Second is body language. Third is the threat of use. But I do not believe that the general staff of the Americans would be committing such specialized forces to a generalized assault on such a huge nation, right? Specialized forces, special forces have special tasks. And there would be specific special targets, one of which they openly talked about, and that was Karg Island, and that was the hydrocarbon export hub of Iran. So this thing about armies wandering into the landmass of Iran, I don't think any general staff is ever going to plan that. But yes, special forces can have special targets which are achievable in their planning. How it manifests on ground is a separate issue, because I am quite sure any kind of land incursion will be stoutly defended as far as the other side is concerned. But there was never a thought of a general invasion with these elements. Yeah.
Right. So, Air Vice Marshal Subramaniam, do you want to add to that? If there is a ground invasion that happens, how do you find Iran posing a very different sort of a symmetry compared to the ground invasions that have happened in the past by American troops, by NATO, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Libya, whether it's Afghanistan?
I think I fully endorse what General Langer said, that the positioning of ground troops, specialized Marines in medium amounts of quantity, the 82nd Airborne Division moving to Europe, are all classic acts of coercion with a threat in being. Now, viewers would like to understand that the size of Iran is that of Iraq and Afghanistan combined. The terrain is extremely hostile, particularly in the north. The approaches to the urban areas are very well defended. The regular Iranian army and the IRGC are deeply committed to the survival of the regime, and therefore there is no doubt in my mind that they will fight to the end, given the kind of fervor that the regime is defended by, right? And therefore, I think a professional military like the United States, given its recent history of Iraq and Afghanistan, will think very, very carefully before launching a wide-ranging ground assault. And please remember that it's not, if the United States decides to launch a ground assault, they would need extensive amount of air power as support also. Now, so it becomes a full-fledged conventional operation that could lead to the dragging on of the war for weeks or even years, which I mean to say no contemporary US president will have the appetite for, given the track record in Iraq and Afghanistan, given that President Trump is dealing with the possibility of a midterm election in December. So ground troops being committed in the conventional sense, I don't think will happen. However, I think what has been carefully thought out as a sequential process to this whole war has been the ongoing naval blockade. Right? Now, if the blockade is conducted with all seriousness and effectiveness, that is an extremely potent coercive choking element for the Iranian economy, right? And so I think all pointers are that it is prolonged coercion that is likely to more likely to lead to negotiations and some kind of a lukewarm settlement, rather than continued application of brute force.
Right. Though, of course, it's come as a welcome relief. Now, there are a lot of ifs and buts attached to it, because today, as Israel and Lebanon announced a 10-day interim ceasefire, we've seen a tweet coming from the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, a short while ago, where he said that the Strait of Hormuz today is open for all to transit through for this interim period of the truce, if it holds, till it holds. Now, again, as I said, that all of it is extremely fragile and extremely difficult to predict till what time will it hold. But General Langar, you know, as people who have headed commands, operations, logistics, how do you really wargame a situation when you're preparing for this kind of thing? I mean, did the Americans not see that suddenly the Strait of Hormuz, which was perfectly fine and open before 20th of February, that you actually gave the reasons to the Iranians to try and gain maximum strategic leverage out of this strait? And if the Americans want to block it with their Navy blockade, the Iranians have been saying, we will also blockade the blockade, and in turn also blockade the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb. So how do you really see this kind of a scenario subject to, if this truce doesn't hold, we have to be prepared for any sort of resumption of war? How do you look at the scenario blowing up, sir?
Yeah, so, you know, I can understand completely Iran's point of view of why they have had to go to this level of escalation in the waterway. But purely, if I put myself back into the United Nations, there is no justification for blocking an international waterway. It's an international waterway. It's not a canal. It's not a man-made canal, right? Tomorrow you will want to block Malacca or Lombok. These are international waterways which are recognized by international law. So yes, as I said, while I understand the position that they have taken because of a sequence of coercion and counter coercion or pressure and counter pressure, but let's not get away from the legality of the situation. It is an international. Even if a modicum, even if a fig leaf of the international order is to prevail, if we are going to abandon everything in waterways and seaways, where is humanity going to be? You're supposed to be in the era of recognizing Millennium Development Goals, not war. And in a region which is so essential for the progress of humanity, right? It's a breach of all, shall I say, international agreements. It's an international waterway. It's not something you have the benefit of geography. You can block it. I mean, do we block the Park Strait? Does India and Sri Lanka block the Park Strait? Much narrower, but it's an international waterway. So both sides are true. And as far as your thing about wargaming, yes, of course. The intimate amount of wargaming is done, and a tremendous amount of scenario building is done. But finally, what is in the mind of a protagonist or protagonists, and how they will respond to certain stimuli, and how firmed in they will get, is always unpredictable. It is always unpredictable. I mean, there was a scenario which said that there is going to be a popular uprising in Iran. That never happened, right? So let us say there was more popular internal dissent. Maybe the stand would have been different. We don't know. But these are all highly dynamic factors, a limited amount of which the general staff can appreciate, right? But the strength of any general staff strategic planning, because you're talking about strategy, the strength of strategic planning is preparing for contingencies and creation of reserves, right? Which both sides have shown. Both sides have shown that they have the ability, the tenacity, and the ability and the capability to continue, which shows that both sides have wargamed the need for reserves very well.
Right. There are two questions that have come into the chat box, but they are mostly on the diplomatic realm. So feel free to, of course, answer it in your own way. If I could take Ankan's question to Air Vice Marshal Subramaniam, because he asks about the status of the United Nations clearly not being able to bring peace to the world. And he asks how UN is working, whether it is a failure of this body or anything else. And Abraham has a question on to what extent do you think geopolitical and economic factors such as Iran's shift towards non-USD currencies play a role in US actions compared to concerns about Iran's nuclear program? So maybe we could start with you, Air Vice Marshal Subramaniam, on the question on the UN.
Yeah. So, that's, as a historian, I've been wanting to share a few perspectives that directly feed into this concern of the questioner about the legitimacy and the strength of the United Nations in today's kind of conflict scenarios, right? So I think there's been a complete breakdown in the rules-based world order. And we are back to the age of Thucydides, the great Greek historian, who said that the strong will do what they can and the weak will endure what they must. But what we have seen with a little bit of difference here, both with Ukraine and Iran, is that the weak will also not capitulate that easily. The weak will also devise strategies to fight back. And these are what we call asymmetric strategies. Now, back to the question about the United Nations. Well, it is my firm opinion that the United Nations are an organization that the world needs now like never before. Because the United Nations brings in a voice of sanity, brings in a voice of the global south, it brings in the voice of the less powerful countries, and basically it forms the edifice of a rules-based world order. And that is why you see that the countries like India, the European Union, some elements of BRICS haven't abandoned the United Nations as a forum for expressing themselves, right? Now, it's a different matter that countries such as, that the powerful and very, very individual leader-dominated powers are cocking a snook at the United Nations and doing what they want. But I think it's too early to sound the death knell of the United Nations. The United Nations still has a role to play in the international world order. And, taking what General Langer said, UNCLOS and the rules of the sea are something that cannot be sort of abandoned, right? And talking about Iran blocking the Straits of Hormuz, it is part of a brinkmanship strategy, right? For Iran, this is now an existential war. And in an existential war, there are really no rules. And when you're operating in an environment wherein you won't follow any rules, then brinkmanship is the order of the day. And I think that way, the European Union has been fairly stable in its approach to this whole conflict. And I think that's the kind of stability that countries like India also must provide to ensuring that the rules-based world order is back in flow. Talking about reserve currency, it's nothing new. For quite some time, ever since China has emerged as a significant economic competitor to the United States, there have been talks of alternative currencies. Why do you think gold is emerging as such a powerful hedge against the dollar? De-dollarization is the buzzword across the world. But here again, I think we must take this whole process of de-dollarization with a pinch of salt. The United States still, by far, is the most powerful economic power also in the world, and it will fight tooth and nail to oppose de-dollarization of any kind.
Just taking forward that question to you, General Langer, when it also comes to that American objective of why it went to war with Iran, there is Israel, there is Netanyahu, who has been trying to get an American president involved in the war for the past 2 decades. But is it really about the Iranian nuclear program, which, by the way, Trump claimed to have obliterated in the 12-day conflict last year as well? And if, I were to be the devil's advocate, if I were Iran, and one of the conditions is that you also bring in your ballistic missile program under the purview of this kind of a nuclear agreement, something that Iran had agreed to in 2015 in JCPOA, not the ballistic part of it, but to IAEA safeguards. Would Iran, in today's circumstances, agree to a broadened nuclear agreement, something that would make the Israelis and the Americans happy?
Yeah, I'll answer your question, but I'll take a leaf from what Arjun said, and I am in full agreement with him that in the time spectrum that has passed, the EU has shown itself rather well as compared to the UN. And since I've served in the UN, in a critical department, let me just say that the problem or the inability of the UN to perform in certain circumstances is because of the inequity which exists in the Security Council, with 5 permanent members who have the ability to stymie proceedings. And it has happened fairly recently. If I have to go back in the Syrian war, there were 17 vetoes during the 17 war, 17 vetoes to ensure that there was no resolution that went through to help most of the refugees, in fact, in Syria. So it's all that you've got in town is the United Nations. You need to be strengthening it, and you need to be allowing it to act. I give you a classic example. I was used to deal with plans. If you were to give the problem of the Straits of Hormuz to an international task force under the UN, they will police it and they will manage it and they will ensure that whatever mandate the UN gives them, they will implement it. And it will be peaceable and it will be usable by everyone. All this is doable, right? But when there is a desire not to let a neutral body to come and perform based on an international mandate, then you miss out on getting the UN, right? As far as your comments related to the continuing conflict and the manner in which this conflict is going to manifest.
The Iranian nuclear program in that context.
And the nuclear program whether the nuclear strikes against the nuclear site which were conducted by the United States were fully successful or not, we don't know. We can only guess, right? But if Iran was to look at its own circumstances and look at it with a view to the future of Iran, let's just say looking at your own future, I feel wisdom would be to despite all that they have agreed to do in the past, wisdom would be to definitely negotiate a more flexible, a more acceptable agreement with Israel and the United States, because each of these countries, you have to see the perspective from which they view themselves. Israel is a very small geographic extent, and it views itself in that geographic extent in a particular way, right? And there is a huge apprehension on increasing the nuclear club. Right? Look at this state that we have in North Korea, right? You have a person who largely does not want to be in anybody's control. So if you were just to look at the future of Iran, possibly the leadership would come to a more acceptable agreement during this window of opportunity that there is, which will assuage both the United States and Israel related to the nuclear fears, specifically in that spectrum.
Okay. Parvati has a question. You can go ahead and ask.
Okay. While we are talking about all these strategy and all these things, how do we put human rights in this regard? Like everywhere, women's rights, especially women's rights and children's rights, are violated on a large level. And we have international agencies or organizations that is silence, that keeps a silence on these issues. From Ukraine crisis, be it Gaza, be it Iran or whatever it is, war zone violates the civilian rights as well. How can we put an end to this?
Okay, thanks, Parvati. And if I may add, Air Vice Marshal Subramaniam, since you've been in the UN, we've also seen killing of the UNIFIL members, UN peace troopers in Lebanon, in the ongoing Israeli invasion. We have seen killing of journalists. In Gaza, there's a genocide. The International Court has, of course, said that Mr. Netanyahu is a war criminal. Do all wars, of course, nobody wants to fight a war to lose the war. You fight it ruthlessly with everything that you have at your hands. But does it really have to be this inhuman and increasingly so much more gross violation of, the standard laid protocols, which do exist even in international wars?
So firstly, a small correction. I haven't served in the UN, but I'll take on Parvati's question and maybe General Langar can add on. But you see, like I mentioned, that warfare in recent times, particularly with the advent of asymmetric warfare, has actually thrown a lot of rules of war fighting. You see, in the past, professional armies also fought under a banner of certain ethics and values, right? There was a template of war fighting. There was something. There have been rules of the ethics of war that have laid down and come down across the ages. But gradually, as we have seen the evolution of asymmetric warfare, these rules of warfare have been thrown out of the window. Terrorists use civilians as a backdrop for conducting war. Conventional forces are forced to fight with one hand tied behind their backs, and at times engage in disproportionate use of force in retaliation for attacks emanating from civilian populations. So the rules of war here again have gone out of the window. Now, in such a scenario, the weak and the vulnerable suffer the most. And the weak and the vulnerable in both Gaza and in Iran have been women and children, right? And therefore, I'm afraid I don't have any easy answers to Parvati as to how can the world at large alleviate this gross anomaly that is appearing in the conduct of war, wherein there is nobody to protect the weak and the vulnerable, not even the state, not even enlightened leaders, not even military personnel. So it's a tough call, and as long as we see a continued proliferation of this kind of a war, wherein you have one side which is facing an existential crisis, and there is another side which attempts to wield all elements of power, I'm afraid the weak and the vulnerable will continue to be weaker and more vulnerable in the years ahead.
I think that's the challenging times that we live in. And while there are a lot of issues that I can continue going on talking to the two gentlemen about, unfortunately, we are running short of time. I'm just going to take one last comment from each of you, which is moving away from this current war. And, General Langar, if I could ask you, because I think it will be of interest to policy aspirants, India is seeing the transition towards an integrated theater command. How do you see this changing the way the Indian armed forces operate? Why is this significant?
Yeah, so just to put the record straight, the Indian armed forces have always operated in an integrated model. There is no war, in recent war. 1962, 47 were unfortunate examples. But there is no recent war which you have not fought in an integrated manner. And there is no conduct of warfare that can be done without full integration and an understanding of each other's capabilities. So theaterization is taking that same thought process forward to a more codified and a more structured, shall I say, disposition in which the alignments between the elements of power, Army, Navy, Air Force, and possibly Coast Guard, will all be structured in a command structure which will be applicable both in war and peace. So that is the thought process. But it does not detract from the fact that in war we fight integrated. I don't want to go back to 71. 71 is a classic example. I know that Arjun is very knowledgeable and he's written a lot on this. But you take the recent conflict that we've had, the short conflict we had in Sindhur, it's completely integrated. Absolutely. It is not possible to think today of a single domain. So therefore, when people talk about now you put boots on the ground, there's no such thing like that. It's all an overall pattern which goes in. So the move towards theaterization and the move towards theaterized commands in the Indian model is very different to the European and the American model. Very different. seeks to have a alignment during war and peace, which would be integrated.
Okay. And Air Vice Marshal Subramaniam, final word from you, because there are a lot of policy aspirants here. What are the kind of key 1 or 2 areas within the armed forces that policy aspirants can actually hope to increase their level of study into, their research into, which will be of interest moving into the future? There's so much of talk about how the future wars, we are already seeing the wars being led by drones, by AI. What would you suggest as policy topics for young students to start working on?
Yeah, the first most pressing requirement is to see how policy makers can integrate their thinking and their ideas with that of the military dimension. And I'm talking about a whole of government approach. So policy makers today must not look at war and conflict in silos. They have to look at war and conflict as a whole of government approach. And that is why there is nothing such as, this is not my business. It has to be your business. And the only way to do that is by widening the scope of your knowledge horizon and understanding the Indian military better, understanding modern warfare concepts, even though you may not be directly associated with the business of the planning and conduct of war. So that's number one. Concentrate on a whole of government approach. The second issue that I would like to build on is this whole issue of integration, right? When one talks about integration, I don't think it's more important for anyone other than India or anyone more than India, because you see, look, our defense budget has been hovering around 2% for the last many, many years. This is considered by any yardstick to be suboptimal for a country of India's size and for the threats that it poses. And yet, it is a reality that in the next couple of decades, it will not go more than 2 to 2.5%. So what do you do about it? So as policy makers, you have to do whatever you can in order to ensure that 2 plus 2 plus 2 is not 6, but becomes 10. And that is what is integration. That is what is integration, the ability to do more with less, the ability to understand each other better is something that policymakers would do well to embrace over the coming decades.
Okay, I think those are some fantastic points and a lot of food for thought today. We hope to have you back again for more detailed conversations because there's just so much to pack in. Just a quick gentle reminder to the participants that the admission cycles are on for the Kautilya School of Public Policy, the MPP course. You can check out the prospectus and meet these fabulous gentlemen on campus if you happen to be there. But, feel free to, of course, follow them on their social media handles to engage with them and follow up with your questions that we couldn't take in because of paucity of time. But thank you so much, General Langar, as well as Air Vice Marshal Subramaniam for joining us here on this edition of the Kautilya School of Public Policy's Let's Talk Policy.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
And that's all that we have time for today. Thanks for watching. Namaskar, Adab, take care.